Hey everybody, thanks for joining me here today. Today we're going to be talking about Topaz InFocus. I will be introducing you to the program and to just some of the possibilities with the program. We'll be going over some before and after images as well as through a couple workflows, and then I'll be answering any questions you may have at the end of the webinar. So with that, let's go ahead and jump right on into the program. InFocus is best used for capture sharpening. It is an amazing sharpener directly out of the camera. So at the beginning of your workflow, before you actually do anything else with your image, if you take it into InFocus, it will really make your image pin sharp, especially if you're trying to blow up your image. Your output will be a very large output. It's a really good idea to do some capture sharpening. It will also help with minor blur and blur that is about 10 pixels or less. So we'll be covering that as well today. But with that, let's just jump on in. This is an image here that looks okay at this level. Now, nothing has been done to this image so far. So it is directly out of the camera. And if I scroll in, you can see it doesn't look very great at 100%. There's an atmospheric haze going on here. Plus, there is a slight blur happening just because of it was taken from quite a distance away. Now, it's not horrible, but it is something if I wanted to blow this up to 100%, it really wouldn't look great. So let's see what InFocus can do with it. And I actually haven't even taken this image in before, so I'm excited to see. So the way that you access InFocus is the same way you do the rest of our programs, by going to Filter, Topaz Labs, Topaz InFocus. And you'll notice that Topaz InFocus is very similar to the rest of our programs. If you are not familiar with our programs, you have a preset panel over here on the left. You have your main viewing window here in the middle, and then you have your adjustments and your preview navigator over here on the right. The preset panel is not going to be very elaborate in this particular plugin, and it is for a reason, mainly because besides just giving you some pre-sharpening presets, every image is going to be different, and presets really aren't going to be great for you unless, of course, you make your own presets for a batch of images or for your camera or just for a sharpening standard that you like. However, we do have 3 presets, and you can just click on them to have it be applied to your original. So here's before. We're at 100% right now. We'll scroll in here in a moment. Here's after. Let's just scroll on in. Okay, you can really, this is at 200%, so it's a little blurry here, but here's before, here's after. Now, some of these pre-sharpening presets are not going to be great for your particular image, so I don't really particularly use these. I end up using the blur type and some of the adjustments, but they are here for you if you like it. You can hide and show your preset preview. Then you can save and delete, import and export your user-made presets. In your menu button, you can choose preferences to turn off the tooltips that are going to be popping up. You can enter your key here. You can contact tech support and access your user's guide if you have any workflow questions or are confused as to what some of the tools are used for. So let's move on. You do have your main viewer window. Again, you can go original and preview. You can also toggle back and forth between your using your spacebar and your left mouse button. And then you have your preview navigator over here on the right. Now, one thing about InFocus, you're not going to be able to zoom out any further than 100%. This is because you can't see exactly what is happening to your image detail any farther back than 100%. So that's not going to have any access. And usually if you are, let's say 25% viewing and it looks good at 25%, then at 100% when you print it out, it's going to be over sharpened. So that's why we have it at 100% default. You can zoom in, I believe, to about 400% for really large images. This is great to be able to tell how many pixels your blur is as well. You can go 1-to-1 to get back to 100%. You can undo, redo, and press your snap feature. Your snap feature is going to take up to 99 snapshots of your adjustment panel down here, all of the different sliders. It will just keep that in its memory, and then you can toggle back and forth using these previous and next buttons to go through all of the different snapshots. Then you have your Reset All button. That's just going to reset everything back to the default area. Your Cancel and OK button to process back into Photoshop or whatever your host program is. So that's your basic overview of the program. So let's go ahead and talk about what InFocus does and how it does it. InFocus uses something called deconvolution technology as opposed to unsharp masking technology, and I'll show you an example of the graphics in just a little bit to show you the difference. But it can be a beautiful sharpener that doesn't add any glow or any halos around as you sharpen. Now, it's not necessarily going to be able to handle severe image blur, but it can handle a little bit of out of focus, less than 10 pixels. That's a key point right there. Or just making a sharp image just really, really tack sharp. And because if you're going to output it a very large size, then you might need that type of look. Let's go over here. I think this is a good option. Again, we're looking at 100%, so it's just a little bit blurry here. We have several different types of blurs to start off with. We have a generic blur, out of focus, straight motion, unknown estimate. Generic blur is just something that we put in there. It's pretty much just a sharpener to help using the deconvolution technology instead of the unsharp mask technology. So you'll have the blur radius, which you can just start taking up. Then as you increase the blur radius, it's going to more and more adjust that sharpness. It's going to get stronger and stronger. Then you have the suppress artifacts. The other two options in here are grayed out when you're in your generic because they aren't useful for this particular blur type. So as you go in, here's before. I'm going to go about 5 seconds each for the before and after so you can really see it. This is the before and after. So immediately you start to see a nice crisping up of all of the details, and it's starting to kind of clear up some of that natural haze. You can continue going up with this, but with the generic, you will start to see a little bit of artifacting as you continually push this. Here's before, and here's after. So yes, it cleared up, it started to sharpen things, but now it's over sharpening on the edges a little bit. So you can take the suppress artifact slider up, and that will start to soften up the areas where it is producing artifacts. But this blur radius was up way too high for this image anyway. So very quickly we could get something that definitely clears up your image. Again, here's before and after. Now let's move on to the out of focus. The out of focus blur type is going to work with out of focus areas in your image. It has the tendency to have a little bit more artifacting because it's a little bit stronger than the generic. So as we take this up, and all of these blur types use a different technology based on the deconvolution technology that's in there. So it's pretty cool. But as you can see, as you push this up to about 2.2, you start to see some artifacting in the trees. So again, the suppress artifacts is really important slider in all of these. So that will just help with smoothing out those areas that get over sharpened. Here's before and here's after. This really isn't the right one for this image, so it's not looking great. So we'll play with that in a little bit. The straight motion blur type I'd say is the most difficult to work with, just so you know. The reason being is it's very difficult for the image, unless it's for an image to be straight motion in the entire image. For example, like the motion blur can be handshake, and usually handshake has some sort of curve to it, or it's somebody moving in your image or an animal moving in your image, and they probably are not moving in a directly straight type of motion in their entire body. So what I always suggest if you're working with motion blur is to actually go into remask and cut out the area that you're working with, or you can only look at that area when you're working in InFocus and not focus on the rest of your image, and then put a layer mask on back in Photoshop or whatever host program you're using, because that is going to give you a better result on the rest of your image that way. So again, it's just kind of difficult to have just straight motion, but here we have the blur radius again. Then you have your motion angle here. This goes from 0 to 180, so you get to tell the program what angle it is if it's really obvious. And then you have your suppress artifacts here as well. And then we come to my favorite type of blur type. This is the unknown estimate blur type. The unknown estimate blur type is great because what it does is it lets the program decide for you what the blur is and how the blur is affecting your image. So all you have to do are set the sliders at certain positions and click the button Estimate Blur, and it will do its best to give you a good result. So in this particular image, there's not a lot of blur here, but it's pretty fuzzy. So I'm going to go up to about 4 for my blur radius, and I'm going to take my edge softness down. You'll notice that the angle slider actually changed into the edge softness slider. The edge softness slider, as you increase the value, it starts to decrease the areas where it might be overshooting in your image just a little bit, causing some artifacts. So that's an important slider as well. But you don't want to go too high with it because then you're just putting that blur right back into all the areas. So I'm going to leave that at about 0.2, and then I'm going to click on Estimate Blur. This is an important workflow tip here for you because you do need to set both the blur radius and the edge softness before you press your Estimate Blur. Then you can come back in here and see how it's affecting your image. If you want to change it, you want to put your blur radius up higher, you can change that, but then you're going to need to come and press Estimate Blur again because you've changed that value. It's going to reprocess your image. And this is something we put in there so it doesn't process your image every single time you change the sliders, because that would just take a little bit of time. But I'm hoping that you can see on your screen, here's before, here's after. This did a beautiful job of sharpening. I'm going to take my suppress artifacts down. And I'm going to go into the area maybe where you can see it. I'll scoot in just a little bit. We'll go into a different image to show you really what it can do. But here's before, here's after. Again, this is 200%. Here's before, here's after. If you'll take a look at these rocks and the trees right here, you can really start to tell how it tightened everything up without actually producing any halos or contrast along the edges. So now as I go back, I've really sharpened up this image quite a bit. I'm hoping you can see that on your screen. Again, here's before. I'm holding that down. And after. Now we move on to our sharpening tools. The sharpening tools actually use the unsharp mask technology. It is an advanced unsharp mask technology, but it is something that is more familiar type of sharpening. So if you want to even sharpen up a little bit more, you can just take that sharpness and sharpness radius up, and that's going to give you a little bit more sharpness using the unsharp mask technology. And then you have your micro contrast slider. I'm going to take the sharpness down because I added a few artifacts there. There we go. Then we have our micro contrast slider. That is going to be great for textures and especially rough textures, because what it'll do is it'll add a little bit of refinement to your very, very fine detail. Just kind of make it stand out just a little bit more. If I go into my de-blur, I'm just going to press my suppress artifacts a little bit more. And here I'm pretty happy with my capture sharpening. Here's before and after. Because these are full-size images, it does take a few minutes to actually process the image back, but I wanted to make sure you knew that processing at a full image size is the way to work with this program. You don't want to take a resized image in. However, I was asked yesterday about whether this works as well on JPEGs as it does on RAW images. And the answer is yes, it does. It's just better, I feel, to work with your raw images. We could work on this one. This is a JPEG image. It's a very small image, actually. This is the 100%. It's been resized. It was originally taken as a JPEG, and I can just make a copy of my image here. It's just a little bit fuzzy. It's not really out of focus. It's just somewhat fuzzy, and that's where InFocus really shines. So I'm going to come over to my sharpening tools, and this is a very high sharpening, and here's before, here's after. Again, this is the full-size image, so it really does a great job sharpening everything up. It sharpens a little too much in the outer areas, but you can mask that out or just take in part of it. Again, here's before Here's after. And if you don't want to work with that, you can come over here to your unknown estimate. Take your, let's reset all. Get back to the blurry area. Unknown estimate. Take this up a little bit. Put my edge softness pretty high because these are pretty strong lines. And estimate my blur and see what happens. Okay, so here's before. Here's after. It added some artifacts within the area. I think we just over sharpened it a little, but you can tell immediately how it can really be beneficial to even JPEGs or resized images. It doesn't only have to be used on RAW. That's a little better. Here's before. Here's after. That actually does a beautiful job. Okay, let's cancel out of there. Let's move on to... Oh, this is also one I wanted to show you. This is also a JPEG image. This is a little bit blurrier than the other image. Nothing has been done to this JPEG in the sense of resizing at all. So it's a little bit in better shape than the dandelion is. But I want to show you that it is quite blurry. You can kind of tell up here with the glass. This has quite a bit of artifacts here already. But if I just put it in this area, and I work with my unknown estimate blur, maybe go up to about 5, take my edge softness to about 0.2, leave my suppress artifacts, press estimate blur, and keep an eye on this glass up here, this shattered glass. So immediately before, after, if you take a look at the background over here, this is before and after. So it just sharpens everything up. I think it went a little too far for this image. If it goes too far, it's very easy to fix. You just have to change that blur radius a little bit. There we go. Here's before and here's after. If you go to 100% or 200%, you can really start to see the difference here. Here's before and after. Look at the trees back here. They just start to come into focus. All right, let's go back to a raw image, and I want to talk to you about some of the issues that you might run into and how to resolve them with InFocus, or some of the issues you might run into in InFocus, just a few tips. With that blur estimate, which I think is probably the most powerful thing within InFocus, and really the reason to get it is that blur estimate, blur type, you have to make sure that your preview is sitting on a certain portion of your image. Let me get back to my open here. There we go. Okay, now that I haven't done anything to this image, I'm just going to get my background copy. This is directly out of the camera. And hop on into InFocus. Now this is not a very blurry image. If we take it over here into the area of our foreground, you can tell that this is pretty in focus, not bad at all. As you come here to your background, of course, just naturally it's going to get a little bit more blurry. But that's where we're going to focus today, is on the more blurry areas. Now, putting your preview on strong lines, such as this type of preview here, where you have all these really strong lines, you have a lot of contrast going on, is going to be much more effective than putting your preview on, let's say, here, where you have a lot of empty space and the lines aren't really that defined, or maybe even over here. This is going to overprocess the rest of your image because it's going to try to create stronger lines. It's going to try to create that sharpening effect within an unsharp area, within a part that's not supposed to be sharp. So if you go to an area that has really strong lines like this is going to give you a much better result on your entire image. Another important thing to note is that when you are down here in this area, this will process differently. Like I just said, it'll process differently, but it will affect your entire image at what it processes this little view area. And if you come up here, whatever is processed here, it's going to be a different result, and that's going to be applied to your entire image. So it does matter where your viewfinder is, or where your navigator is in your image itself. So here we're looking at the image at 200%. We just take the blur, and it's blurry because it's 200%, plus we're looking at a more background area. You can tell it's fuzzy right here. I just want to work with this area, and you can see how it just tightens up that blur around the words. So let's go into the unknown estimate. I'm going to take this down to about 3 since it's not a significant blur. Take my edge softness, leave it right there, leave my suppress artifacts around, and just press estimate blur. Okay, immediately I see that this halo or sharp contrast is starting to happen. And one reason is going to be my micro contrast. I'll just take that on down. But when you start to see that overshooting in certain areas, you can just take that suppress artifacts and kind of work that up, and that's going to be helpful. It starts to disappear. You can also take that edge softness up. As you take the edge softness up, you're going to need to also press the estimate blur again. So we're going to do that. And that's better. Here's before, and here's after. If it starts to not look great, you can try and test out a few different things. We can go to 4 and make it more sharp, but there the contrast is a little bit more. Here's before, here's after. You can try that edge softness and more suppressed artifacts. Okay, here's before, here's after. We are looking at this at 100%. I'm going to take my blur radius back down to 3. I feel like that was a better choice. Here's before, here's after. It's definitely a better choice. And now I'm going to look at the rest of my image at 100% and see what happened. So here's 100%. And if you'll take a look at the signs, that's what we were looking at. Here's before. Everything's pretty blurry. This is the background area. And here's after. It really just made everything stand out. It brightens things up a little bit. If I take this over to my focused area, you'll notice that here's before, here's after. It just sort of makes everything more crisp and clear. This is a great area too to look at, these blinds. Here's before and here's after. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. I have a bunch of questions coming through. Just press OK here. Tom asked a good question. He says, in the preset panel, what is the difference between the common and the detailed? The common, detailed, and mild are just 3 different strengths. The common is the middle. It's the most common type of image in the sense of it works on a lot of images that we've brought in. Using that common will be pretty effective in sharpening your image. The detailed will sometimes, for certain images, become a little too strong, but if that's what you're looking for, that detailed is there for you. And then the mild almost imperceptibly sharpens your image, which is what some people like as well, just to get it a little bit more sharp. Richard says, use InFocus first, then other Topaz programs next, then detail last, normally. Yes. Let me pull this up. There we go. Our Topaz workflow looks like this. Here we have your first kind of tier of our programs that you would use. You need to use all 3 of them, but this is the first tier, and then the second tier where you work with more of the exposure, the color, that type of work, and then more the artistic stuff with clean and simplify, where you're actually removing or adding or smoothing out certain elements within your image, and then detail last. Now again, I usually use maybe 2, 3, 4 of these products within my workflow for certain images. I don't know that I've ever used all 10, but if you do want to use all 10, you would use InFocus first, and then move it on to JPEG and then denoise. There are certain situations that we discovered yesterday as we were working with a super high ISO image. It was on 25,600 as the ISO, and as I was trying to go take that into InFocus, it really thought the large amounts of color noise were detail, so it was sharpening that up. So that might be a situation where you would use denoise first, but overall, your InFocus is going to be the first step in your Topaz workflow. Mark says, if you don't know what kind of deblur it has, how do you calculate the deblur radius? That's a really good question. The deblur radius is going to be, let me open up an image and I'll show you. Well, this image, let's just go on into it and see if we have a major blur here, which we don't in the focused area. But here in the unfocused area, you can start to see where the edge starts to soften up. And it's right here along the edges. And this would be an out of focus type of blur. That is what we're talking about with the blur radius. As you scroll in even more with it, you'll start to see that this is actually many more pixels than you might have thought initially. So here we're looking at about 7 or 8 pixels in this out of focus area. That is the blur radius. So it's a pretty high blur radius for our program, and it would definitely take a bit of work to make it look in focus. So that is the idea of the blur radius. If we were to get rid of our in focus one, just open up my history. There we go. Okay, so if we go into this image, this again is not very super blur, but as you continually go in, you'll see that these softer edges have about a 3 pixel on each side softening, and that is what we're talking about with the blur radius. So if I was to go into InFocus, that is where I would start. And sometimes it's not perfect. Sometimes you do have to. The InFocus is probably, well, it's not probably, it is the program in the Topaz lineup where you're going to have to work at getting it to look good. It's not going to happen usually the very first time. So even if you're using this unknown estimate and the program is working for you, you still might have to play around with the blur radius several different times. Let me press reset all. Get back to the unknown estimate. Just take my blur radius up to 3 where we said. I'm going to take my edge softness up to about 0.2. It's really a good value, I find, to put your edge softness to start off with. It has a lot of lines to work with, so I'm just going to say estimate blur and see how that works. Okay, so here's before. Here's after. Now this looks okay, but on my screen it starts to look a little over sharpened in certain areas. So first I'm going to take my suppress artifacts up to about 0.4. Okay, and that starts to help, but not great. So I'm going to take my blur radius down to 2 and say estimate blur again. And that's a much better choice for this image. Here's before, here's after. If you look here in the edges are up in this blue area, here's before and after. So that's how the blur radius can be actually looked at. Here's an image I worked on yesterday that I think I can do a better job on today. Let's get rid of, and this will show you some of the selection and the masking portion of the images. So here's the original image, which when you're looking at it at 16.67% doesn't look too bad. But when you go up close to it, we're at 66% here, it becomes evident that the focal point was not on her eyes. Her eyes are not in focus, her ears are in focus, and her collar back here on the same focal plane as her ears is in focus. Her eyes are out of focus. The bridge of her nose is out of focus, and that's really something, if you wanted to blow this image up, you would need to resolve that. So how do you find out how big your image blur is? You can come in here, getting pretty close, and we're only looking in the blurred areas because that's only the area that we're going to be bringing into the image. Okay, so I'm going to look just underneath her eye right here. And to me, it looks like we're starting to hit about, well, more than 10 pixels in this area. So the first thing I would do in this particular workflow is resize this image. And I should have done that yesterday. That probably would have helped. So the reason I'm resizing is because InFocus is not going to be able to handle an image that has a larger pixel blur than 10. And if you're looking at a raw image like this straight out of the camera and you have a significant blur, and this isn't even significant when you're looking at it from 16%. But if you have a big blur where you can actually see motion blur, you're probably, if you're looking at a raw image, you're going to need to resize that for InFocus to be even starting to handle that. So that's probably one of our biggest questions is, why doesn't this work on my image blur? And then somebody will send us an example picture and you'll go and you'll look at the blur and it's a 40, 50 pixel blur, when you're looking at it that close. And it's just not going to be able to resolve that type of blur. So I'm going to take this down to about 3000. Say okay. It's not a small image at this point by any means. We can still work with it at a pretty large level. So now I'm going to go ahead and make a background copy, take that into, and actually I'm not going to take that into InFocus. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to go into Remask. The reason being that I'm only going to be taking her face and her snout into the program. Otherwise, it's going to start to try to evaluate or make the rest of the image. So this is one way of doing a selective type of workflow. If only one area of your image is out of focus. So I'm going to say okay to this. And then I'm just going to take that layer directly into InFocus. And even though it shows the entire image, it's only going to be working with her eyes. I could have applied the layer and it would have just brought her face in there, but I did not. So let's take a look at something that has strong lines, which this blurry area doesn't. So I'm going to come over here and include the collar and see if that helps. I'm going to go to my unknown estimate blur. I can go into the eye and kind of see how many pixels we're dealing with, maybe about 6. So let's try that first. See what happens. Estimate blur. Okay, here's before. Here's after. Again, before and after. Because we included these really sharp lines, it's really calculating that area. So I'm actually going to come over here and see what happens if I come in here and try this again. I'm going to estimate the blur again. Okay, so you can see it did something much different to the entire image because I was there. Now this is definitely over sharpening, but look at it, just her eyes. Here's before, here's after. We're starting to get somewhere. First I would take my suppress artifacts way up because it's a really blurry area that we're dealing with her. I would take my edge softness up and I'm going to take my blur radius up to about 8 and see what happens. I should have put the preview navigator back in the same area. Now it's going to calculate something a little different. So this time we'll go in like we were before. Take my edge softness down, my blur radius maybe down to about 5. I'll try this one more time. See, this is what happens with InFocus, and it does start to get a little bit frustrating, but it is helpful. Here's before, here's after. Again, this is a pretty strong blur, so I'm just having fun now, but this is my workflow. Let's see what happens if I take that edge softness down. There we go. Here's before, here's after. So this doesn't look great on the rest of the image, on her fur, anything, but I just want to get her eyes to be a little bit more in focus. So I'm going to say okay, and it's going to apply it just to her face area. And here's what it looks like at 66%. Here's before, and here's after. Show you this one more time. Here's before and after. So it does look much more sharp in the areas that we want it to. It's a little over sharpened for me in her fur in that area. So all I'm going to do is paint on this mask that was created in Remask, and I'm going to quickly take my black color, opacity 100. Let's make that about 60. Take my hardness down. And just paint in the areas where I really don't want it to be affecting it too much. So if you notice this left eye over here, here's before, here's after. Just sharpen it up really nicely, and it de-blurred it to a point where at 66% doesn't look very bad. It looks pretty good, and it looks better than it did before, which was out of focus. Really got that catch light going on. I'm going to go ahead and answer some more questions here. Okay, great question coming up from Mark. He says, do you use InFocus as your general focusing or Topaz Detail for your everyday sharpening? There are very different types of sharpening. InFocus is specific for this capture sharpening to be able to deal with a little bit of this out of focus blur that might be occurring, such as in this photograph, or just to tighten up any sort of, let's take this one in too, I'll show you this. This is a more in focus image, and this would be my workflow for this. I would first take it into InFocus, and it's pretty in focus. If I go over here and look at little puppy, you'll see all of this is at 100%, and you start to see some of the fur and everything. There is quite a bit of noise going on in here, quite a bit of color noise. It was indoors with no flash, but I still suggest going to InFocus first for this type of image. And all I'm going to do is maybe give a small blur radius, small edge softness, take my suppress artifacts down to the default, and press estimate blur. Okay, this is a little much. You can start to see some artifacts coming up, so I'm just going to click on that, take that up a bit, take my blur radius down, estimate again. And this is just to give it a little extra sharpening right in the beginning. So now we have here's before, here's after. You can really start to tell on the texture of the brick over here and the texture of her eye. Here's before, here's after. Just starts to get a little bit more in focus, and that's the idea. It does add some artifacts in some areas that you can use the suppress artifacts to work with, but you still are able to really heighten that focus on the fur. Now, this is something I would use in the beginning. Detail is something I personally use as my very last thing in the workflow. Detail is more for output sharpening, and then some creative sharpening if you want to do that during your workflow. But detail is specific, and we always suggest to be used at the end. The InFocus program is much more specific to capture sharpening and before processing anywhere else. I do know many users who use InFocus at the end of their workflow and really enjoy it. So I think what works for you, what workflow is best for you, is still makes you end up with a quality image will work. So I think that if it works for you at the end, by all means, keep going. Again, I just want to reiterate, I have a lot of people asking how I'm determining the number of pixels in the blur. It does take practice. It does take playing around with the program to figure it out. Let me do this one because this is a little bit more obvious, and I'm going to go way in on this image. This is how I'm determining the pixels. So here we have the beginning image. Okay, we have a pretty strong line, a pretty big difference between the light and the dark stripes. In the blurred image, you'll start to see that the pixels, okay, have now become, you've separated those pixels and just kind of, they're now more fuzzy. It takes a longer transition to get from your dark pixels to your white pixels than it does up here, where this is a much stronger contrast. This is just a fuzzier, more, it just takes more time. This was blurred. So that is how I'm determining, and I'm counting the actual squares, the actual pixels in the fuzzy area between these two edges. And that is how I'm determining blur radius. And that is what we mean by the blur radius. So for this particular image, if I was working with an image that had this same blur, I would come in and I'd count about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 or so pixels of blur. And that's where I would start in my estimate blur. And then just to give you an idea of kind of as we're looking at it like this is what the unsharp technology can come up with. It really does work with that contrast. And it can be really good for certain types of images, and it can be really good at a certain point in your workflow. But when you're doing capture sharpening, it's not the best. And this is InFocus, the deconvolution technology on the edges. It will try to put that image back together. Granted, again, I do want to make sure you know this was blurred using the Gaussian blur technique just to show the difference between the two technologies. So you're probably not going to get an image that you're able to completely put into perfect focus if it's really blurry. You're just going to be able to tighten up the edges and make it seem like it is much more in focus, because it actually is enhancing the actual focus as opposed to the parent focus. Frank says the paws look very noisy. Anything that can be done on this area? Yes, Frank, because this image was taken, I believe, with 1600 or 3200. It was taken indoors with no flash, and it's not a very well lit room, so it did have a very high ISO. So the original image does have, here's the original, not the InFocus, does have quite a bit of image noise within the paws, within the darker areas. This is definitely an image that I would take into denoise immediately after InFocus. So InFocus deals with the capture sharpening and just increasing the sharpness of the lines and the edges of the image, but denoise will then go in and further help your image by eliminating all of the noise within the darker areas of your image. Shadow areas really tend to show the noise quite well. So that's why you're seeing it more in the paw than you are, say, in the facial area, but it is still everywhere. Kevin asked a great question. He said, can InFocus be used in a black and white image? Absolutely. The only thing, all of our programs, including the black and white effects actually, because it is a black and white converter, all of our programs need to be RGB images. So the only black and white images that it's not going to accept is if you have a grayscale image. If you do have a grayscale image, it's very easy. So let's say you have a grayscale image. This is not going to be able to go into Topaz InFocus or any of our Topaz programs. But if you just come to your mode and you go to RGB color, it's not going to change the color of your image very much. You'll have much more control of it in our programs, and it's just an RGB image now, even though it still is grayscale. So that's how you would be able to take that into InFocus at that point. So just make sure you're working with RGB. Earl says, wouldn't denoise soften the image after sharpening it? That's a really good question as well. Denoise is pretty well known for eliminating the noise while still keeping the detail of your image. If you took the image into denoise first, though, and you did over soften it and you did remove a lot of information and those edges were a little bit softened, it's going to be that much more difficult for InFocus to recognize the edges, recognize those strong lines, and to try to deblur your image and tighten up all those areas that need to be tightened up. That is why we do suggest InFocus first. The majority of the time, people using denoise are using it for high ISO noise reduction. I like to use it for any type of noise reduction personally, but you don't need to overuse it or really get to the softening point that denoise can get to in an image unless it's really high ISO, and then you can bring back the detail and the detail recovery area portion of denoise pretty well, even if you've gone to InFocus first. But that is the suggested workflow, is InFocus and then denoise. Again, there are exceptions to every rule. Let me show you this image, if I have it up still. Here we go. This image was taken way back in an arena. I was way up high, so very far back in an arena. I was also using ISO 25,600. I was on H2 on my Mark D2. So if you go close and you really, this is at 200%, you'll start to see there are these big splotches of this very ridiculously obvious color noise and regular noise as well, but it's really obvious. And we took this into InFocus yesterday, and while it did strengthen up the lines and the blur that was happening down here pretty well, it really made this color noise stand out that much further. So what it did is it recognized the color noise as lines that it needed to make sharper. So that, because you're making that sharper, would not be good. Denoise is going to have a harder time to get rid of this color noise because you're strengthening it. So here on this particular image, I would say take it into denoise first, get rid of that really strong noise, and then take it into InFocus. But usually InFocus is the one that's suggested. Thanks again for joining me. I'll just be seeing you soon. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.